Hi, everybody. One of the things that I want to do here is I want to talk a little bit about SQLite. I want this to be something that, in addition to the lecture that we look at, to give you some examples of how to use it and also how to use SQLite from within Node, which I think is going to be kind of helpful for the workshop. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a directory. I'm going to call this Acme Employees, and I'm going to CD into it. Okay, so all I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up SQLite 3. So one of the things that you could do with SQLite is that you can open it up. Now, right now, all it's doing is giving me an in-memory database, which is not necessarily what I want. I'm going to quit out of it, and I'm going to say right now, so if you look in my directory, obviously there's nothing in it. Right, not even anything hidden. It wouldn't be a bad idea to do a git init and also to do an npm init. We're going to create a project from this. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say SQLite 3, and this is going to be my Acme database. I'm going to call it Acme DB. Okay, so now I'm in basically the SQLite shell. This is giving me the ability to access this database, which I actually created here. One of the things you could always do here is just type in help to see what you can do here. And some of the help that you have here is that if I wanted to see my tables, I could go over here and say tables. I'm not going to see anything. So let's create a table. I'm going to create a table. I'm going to call it users, and I'm going to put the fields for my users. So usually you're going to want to have some, I don't think SQLite enforces this, but you're going to want to have a primary key. In our case, it's going to be an integer. We'll say that it's the primary key. And I'm also going to have a name, which we'll say is a string. Now if I go over here and I say tables, I'll see my users. If I say select star from tables, select star from users, I'm not going to see anything. So let's do now an insert into our table. So obviously if you have a database, you're going to want to create the database. We'll show you with some of the ORMs that you'll use. You're not going to have to actually manually create the database, but you'll be able to create objects within a node that will actually dynamically go and create the tables. But I'm going to insert into users, and the field that I'm going to insert to is name, and the values I'm going to say I'm going to insert Mo. So now if I say select star from users, I've got Mo. Notice that it gave Mo an ID of 1. If I ended up doing insert into users, name, values, Larry. So the name is the fields, and I'm just inserting into one field, so I'm only putting in name. The values are the value. That's why you see that it's enclosed in a string. So now I've got Larry, select star from users, and all of these 2 users. And if I went over here and I said insert into users, the field is going to be name that I'm inserting into, and the values is going to be curly. Now I'm going to have Mo, Larry, and Curly. So at this point, I can run SQL, write some SQL statements against this database. For instance, I could say, select count, tell me how many users from users. And it'll tell me that the count is 3. Right? I could say select ID, only if I want to select one field. Select ID from users where name is equal to Mo. Now I've got just the ID of 1. So the point here is that you could easily open up SQLite, and you could even find out some information. If I said tables users, It'll tell me I've got the users tables. And let's see, if I say help here, we can even show the schema of a table. If you ever wanted to know what fields were in the table, which you might want to do, I could say, show me the schema for users. And it shows me, and this is really nothing more than the command that I use to create this user table. Now, that's fine, that works. I've got a database. If I go to quit here, and I do an ls, I could see that I actually have my Acme DB, which is my SQL database. I could open it up again, SQLite3, and I could say Acme DB, and it's the same database I had before. Select star from users, which is here. Okay, that's great, and you could do your workshop just with using SQLite to get your queries, but I think one of the things that's helpful is to see how you can integrate your database into an application. More specifically, how do you integrate your database into Node? So there is a package that you could use, and this is going to be SQLite3. I'll say npm So the name of the package that we're going to end up using is SQLite3, and what we're going to do is see how we could query this database from within Node. First thing I want to do is let's install SQLite3. And we'll save it. We're going to be using this for our application. And I'm going to create a very simple app.js file. And so let's go over here and let me open this up in Vim. So right now, if we look at our package JSON file, we've got SQLite3. And I'm going to go over here, and just to sort of keep things simple at the moment, I'm going to create we could call it server, call it whatever you really want to here. We'll run it. I'll call it server.js. And what I'll do over here is I'll say SQLite equals require SQLite3. And let's use nodemon to actually run this. We'll say nodemon server.js. We don't see an error, so obviously it found SQLite3. So looking at this documentation, what we want to do is we're going to want to create this database. And so, in the example that you see here, the database is created in memory. But what I want to do is I want to actually use my database that I actually created before. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, so looking at this, we're going to use the SQLite, we'll call it SQLite3 as well, just like they're doing here. We'll say SQLite3 database, and we'll give the file name. So we'll go over here, and we'll say SQLite3.database, put a new in front of it, and this is just going to be our file, acmedb. So one of the things that's interesting here, let's just do a couple of things here that are kind of interesting. We'll call this db, and we'll say console.log db. And this should actually run. So there's a couple of things that it's telling us here. It's telling us, hey, look, the database is not open. This is the file name. And the mode we could look up, but I think this has to do with whether or not you're going to be just opening up the database for reading or writing or that sort of thing. That's something we could investigate. I'm not that sure about it. So the bottom line is that I really want to work with the database being open. So how could I go about doing that? Well, we ended up looking at the API documentation for SQLite. We could see that when we create a new database, we could specify what the mode is. So I'm assuming one of the modes that we have here, I'm assuming it's probably open, read, and write. That's my guess here. But we see we have other parameters that we could pass in. One of them is a callback. And what's interesting, and probably is not really documented that well here, is that if I specify a callback, so again, not a lot of code here, creating a database. If there was an error opening up the database, it would show up in this variable. So if I say console.log err, tells me no, there's no error. And just in case I maybe thought there was some additional arguments that were being sent here, there aren't. It's just that one parameter that's telling me I don't have an error. So what can I do in that callback? Well, one thing that I can do is that the callback is being called within a context. And if I look at that context and I put in this, what I'll find out is that at that point in that callback doesn't get called unless one of two things happens. Either there's an error, or in fact I was able to connect, in which case I am connected. So now I could see the state of my database is actually open, right? So I've actually got my database there. And one of the things that I could do here is that once I have this connection to my database, now I'm going to use, so I'm going to get rid of this. This was not all that helpful to me here. But I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say, hey, look, my database equals this, right? I've got my database. And just to be clear that I could do that, there's a few methods that we're going to use with this database. One thing we could do is we could close the connection to our database. Not that this makes a lot of sense, but if we wanted to, just to see that we have a close method to close the connection to this database, it tells us, sure, you have a function called close. And if I wanted to, I could actually close it, and I could say db.close. And if I looked at the documentation, this also takes a callback, which is also going to be an error object, I guess, if you had a problem closing it. But if I go back into here, and I was to go back and look at console.log db, it would probably tell me at this point that it's not open. It ended up getting closed. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing here. If I say console.log db up here, it's open because that's in the open callback. It's closed because this is in the closed callback. Now, I'm not going to worry about closing the database. That's not really my concern. My bigger concern is that I want to have an open connection to the database once I start querying the database. So, again, this is just sort of wrapping around this native SQLite object and giving you access to it in Node. Obviously, if you tell it where the file is, it can find the file of your database, but let's be sure that this is the database that we're thinking of. So if we looked at some of the documentation for SQLite, there's a couple things we can do. One of them is actually to get information from the database. We could run a query in the database. And we do that by taking a database object and saying all meaning you want to get a collection of results. Sometimes you might want a collection, sometimes you might want to just get one result. Again, we're not going to be doing a ton of work with SQLite, but this is something that helped me a lot, at least in terms of testing out things for the workshop. So, you know, one of the things that we might be able to do here is to say db.all, and I'll say select star from users, and this has a optional parameter that I could put in here, which would be parameters that I'll pass. I'll show you what that is in a little bit. But it's optional, and I can pass it a callback function. And one thing you'll know is, you know, how does it know that this parameter that you're passing is your parameters or your callback? And parameters is going to be an object. Callback is going to be a function. So usually the way that this is written, and we'll find that out soon enough, that if you end up passing in a function as an argument, it'll assume it's a callback. Now this callback will either give you an error or a result set. And what it's going to do is it's going to map your results to a JavaScript object, which you can use here. And if I say console.log results, I should see that I've got an array of Mo, Larry, and Curly. And this is just a regular JavaScript array that you can manipulate. If you wanted to say results 0 dot length. You could do that. And not result 0 dot length, but results dot length. And that would tell you 3. And let's just for the sake of argument, let's say we wanted to select star from users where name equals, and we wanted to put a value in there. Well, you know, it's a pain to do concatenation with SQL statements. It's something that you want to avoid. So probably what you want to do here is you want to put in a placeholder. And if you put in that placeholder, what you can do is you could end up putting in an array. And so that placeholder will go in place of that question mark. And what that should end up doing is that I should now get a result of 1, right? There's only one user with the name of Mo. We could actually see that this is going to be case sensitive. Right? So that's kind of an interesting thing where you have the ability to run this command, get a result set, and put placeholders into this. And there could be multiple placeholders. I mean, if we went back here, we said, hey, look, where name is Mo and ID equals, and we put a second placeholder, and we gave it an ID of 1, right? Since Mo is our first person in the users table, has an ID of 1, you know, that would work as well. So again, the ability here is to use this SQLite node module to access your database and to be able to query the database. So just to show you one other thing, all is going to give you a result set, but if you only wanted to get one result, and I'm going to do this with another one. I'm going to copy, actually here, I'll just do this. So I'm going to say db.get. This just gives you one result. And sometimes if you want to do something like, hey, look, select all these records, select count from users. And here we're going to end up doing this. And again, we'll have our callback. Now, again, we could either have an error. Here I'm just going to call this result because this only gives me one result. And let's just look and see what it looks like. So here we've got, again, you know, this is coming back to us in a specific order, but I wouldn't necessarily guarantee the order that it's coming back in. The bottom line here is that here we're getting this, the first item, and let's actually do this just so we could really see it, is that when we do all, we get a collection back. It happens to only be one item. When we do a get, we just get one result back. And that works especially well when you're doing this sort of aggregation, things like counts. And if I do something like this, I can give this an alias of count, or I could call it whatever I want to. Call it total, just so you could see. I could call it whatever I want. When I run this, I get this object with a total. So here, I don't have to do any index here. I could say result.total. And what I'm sort of going here, what I'm going towards is being able to just set up a little application that you could end up using to test your interaction with the database. And the way that I'm going to do it is that instead of having all this code here, what I would like to be able to do is to do something like this. Ideally, I would like to be able to create a query, call it QRY, select name from users, and I would like to have some object that I can call. You know, I could call it DB maybe, but I just want it to be a little simpler than this, where I could do something like DB query, and I could pass in this query object and get back some results and see what that looks like. Now, again, this doesn't really exist yet. This is what I actually want to create. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to create a module that'll replace a lot of this code and make it reusable. So I could run really as many queries as I want to. And again, it makes it easy to sort of you know, play around with the database and interact with it and that sort of thing. So that's the next thing that I'm going to take a look at. So in this file, instead of calling this SQLite directly, I'm going to comment this out for a minute. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that DB, this is going to be my database object, which is actually going to wrap around SQLite. But I'll say required DB, which obviously you see there's no DB.js file. If I was to go over here, right, this is going to break. There's no module. Let's create that module. So now it exists, but obviously DB query is not a function. So I'm going to take some of this stuff. I'm going to grab it. I'm going to paste it in here, and I'm going to modify it a little bit. So what I really want to be able to do is I want to return an object that could do a couple of different things. One of the things that I want to be able to do is I want to be able to connect to my database and know when I've connected to my database. I also want to be able to query my database. And I'm going to use these things together here. I'm going to comment this out a little bit. I mean, at this point, this would probably pass because, and I always do this, I'm not really returning. I really want to do a module.exports equals this object literal. I've got my SQLite here. And that should be enough to get rid of this error, although obviously nothing is happening here. So what do I want to do when I end up connecting to the database? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a variable here called DB. And when I connect to the database, I'm going to pass in a callback function. I'm not using this yet, but I could use it, and you know, I think I'll use it in our main file. And what I'll do here is I'm going to copy this function here, this call. And what I'll do is that when I go to connect to the database, I'm going to run a quick check. So I don't want to keep on opening up my database. So say, hey, look, if in fact the database does exist, I'm just using a return here to get me out of here. I'm not really returning anything, but I'm just going to pass a call back with DB. Now, obviously, DB is not assigned anywhere, so it doesn't really make all that much of a difference. But within this guy here, I'll go over here, and we know that this is going to point to my database object. So here I'll say DB equals this, and I'll do a callback of DB. That's going to allow me to connect to my database. If I wanted to test that out, I could go back here, and I could say DB connect, pass in a callback function, and this should give me my database. At that point, it should tell me that it's open. Right, it's open. By the way, I could do this multiple times. Right, it's telling me it's open. The point that I want you to see here is that if I went back here, I would see that I'm only making it down to this line just that first time, right? If I don't really, well, I guess what it really ends up coming down to is that if I don't end up having this DB object, right, it ends up basically creating it for me. So if the database was connected, that's fine, I have it. If not, I'll end up going in, creating it, and doing this callback. So we know that we have a way of connecting to our database. Now let's figure out how we're going to query to our database. So if we could connect to our database, and here we're going to pass in two things. We're going to pass in a query and a callback. Again, I'm not going to worry about the errors at this point. And what I'll do here is I'm going to say, hey, look, connect, and I'll pass in a callback. This will give me my database object. And now once I end up having my database object here, I'm going to say database.all. Here's my query that I'm going to call. And I'm going to give, I'll also pass in, I'll force folks passing in parameters here. I'll put in params, and then I'll get my callback, which will be either my error or my results. And again, all I'm doing here is I'm wrapping around the SQLite library just to make my life a little bit easier. And then once I do that, I can do a callback with my results. Again, I'm not worried about the error handling here. I'm worried about being able to interact with my database. So this query function is going to call connect. I'll get a callback where I'll get my database object, and then I can call it. So really what I'm doing here is I'm dealing with these callbacks, and I'm just doing this here. Might be called lazy loading, where I just want to avoid creating a lot of connections to my database. So if I was able to create my connection, I end up using this connection that I have. Otherwise, I end up going in, I'll end up creating the connection. So here's my query. I'm going to connect. I'll get my database. I'll call all with my parameters. Now if I go back here, and let's say that we're not going to pass in any parameters, so I'll just pass in an empty array here. And I say console log results. Now at that point, I can end up getting my results. I don't really need this db connect here because query is going to go and connect to my database, right? So here is my connection. I'm using a callback. Eventually we'll end up doing this with promises and the code will be a little bit easier to run, but you can just sort of think that query is wrapping around my connect. So it's using the connect, it's using a callback function to get the database, and then it's using the callback that was passed to it to get the results. So here we could do a query, and we could also, just so we have it, do something similar, where instead of a query, we do a get. This just is going to get us one result, and I'll name this result, and that would work well for something where we were just getting one result back, something like we'll go over here and we'll say get, but this time, and I'll just put this in here, and I'll say select count as total from users. And this should give me a result. And if I look at that, results not defined, but result will be defined. So here I've got my total, and here actually you could see that the order, you really can't control the order that well, right? This actually executes faster than this executes, but again, that's just the nature of, doing asynchronous, calling asynchronous code. So here, in fact, if I killed this, I wouldn't be surprised if this came back in a different order the next time it ran. No, which maybe leads you to believe that get is a little bit faster than running the all, which maybe makes a little bit more sense. So again, these are running, these are asynchronous. And again, I'm wrapping around my SQLite so I can end up accessing this database. I've got this nice little set of functions that are going to allow me to interact with my Acme DB database. And that's going to help me out where now I could actually introduce Mocha and Chai, and I could end up running some tests against my database. And again, this could be pretty good in terms of giving the ability to see, that you're writing your queries correctly. So the last thing I want to do is run some tests here. I found this pretty helpful to do. So I'm going to do an npm install, and I'm going to install Mocha and Chai. And again, these are not for my application. These are basically just to run some tests. And I'm going to go into my package JSON because I want to run these tests. So here you have sort of these default echo tests, which just are writing something out. And here I'm going to say nodemon /, and if for some reason nodemon's not installed, you could just install it locally if you want. But I'm going to say modules, and I'll say Mocha bin Mocha to run Mocha. And let's see what happens when I do that. So I'll say npm test. Now I get an error because I don't have a directory called test. So I'm going to create a directory called test, because that's where Mocha is basically by default going to look for a folder called test where you have your tests. And if I save this, rerun it, I'll get passing, but nothing really is passing. So let's add a test. I'm going to call this query spec.js. And so I'm going to describe, let's say, users. So we know that we only have 3 users in the database. And what we would probably do here is we would seed the database with users. And I'll go over here and I'll say count. And I'll say there are 3 users. And I'm going to write a test for it. Again, as I make these changes here, it'll actually think that there's a test that's passing, which there really isn't here. But when you're writing tests that are asynchronous, what you have to do is you're going to have to run your test, and here we're going to be interacting with a database. So we're going to be doing something like this. We're going to say, hey, look, our database, and we have to go up 1 level, and we'll say /db to get our database. And I'm going to want to run a query. I'm going to set up my query, and I'm also just going to show you that if you have text on multiple lines, you could use this backtick and another backtick, and you could put your JavaScript on separate lines. So I'm going to say select name from users. That's going to be the query that I'm going to run. And I'll go over here and I'll say db query, and I'm going to end up doing my query. I don't have any parameters, so I'll make that just empty. This is going to be my callback, which, again, mine is simple. I'm just getting results from my callback. I'm not worried about error messages at this point. Again, query should end up connecting to my database, and I'm going to want to write an assertion. For starters, I could say console.log results. So one of the things that's happening here is you don't see my results. Well, why don't you see my results? I think from the perspective of the test, what happens is that as far as it's concerned, the test doesn't really keep track of the fact that there's something going on here asynchronously. So when you have a test that's going to be asynchronous, you can pass a parameter in here. A parameter, if you put a placeholder for a parameter here, it'll end up getting passed in, and it won't end up calling your test until you call done. Now, in which case what will happen here is that I'll get my users. I'll actually see my users are there, but then it'll time out. And the reason why it's timing out is it's saying, hey, look, you know what? You told me you're going to have a test when you're ready to call done, and you don't have a test, right? Meaning that it assumes that you're going to have some expectation, and then you're going to call done. Now, I don't even have an expectation here, but if I call done, that error will go away, and my test is going to pass. Well, what do I want my test to do? I'm going to have an expectation. I'll say I expect my results dot length to equal 3. Now I get into one other issue here, and that is with Mocha. Mocha doesn't come with an expectation library, but luckily I ended up installing Chai, and now I could go up here and I could say expect equals require Chai, and I will use Chai's expect. So a couple of lines here. The thing is that when any test is going to be asynchronous, you're going to want to use a done here. Now if I go over here, my test will pass. I always like to see it fail before it passes. Let's make it fail by going in here and putting in a 2. And that fails, and we'll get it to pass by putting in 3. Let's do one more. Let's do another test. We'll say Mo is a user. So we'll say select names from users where name equals, and I'm going to use that question mark, and then when I call this query, I'll pass in Mo. Now this is going to fail because there's only one user here, right? But I'm expecting 3, which is not right. So first thing is I could do this as 1. Mo is a user, but let's be a little bit more specific. Let's, instead of using query, we have this other get, which will just get us one result, which is maybe a little bit cleaner for this. So I'll do a get. And then this is going to be my result. And just to keep it simple, I'll say the result that I get, the name is going to equal, and let's get it to fail first. And we'll say it's going to equal curly. And it tells us no, Mo's not equal to curly. You expected Mo to equal curly, which it doesn't. We expect it to equal Mo. And now we've got our 2 tests that are passing. So this is a good way that if you have your database set up with a little bit of code here, you can end up having your basically wrap around your SQLite. So your tests are not dependent upon SQLite. They're going to be dependent upon this DB object. And you could go in here and you could end up writing your tests against your database with your expected results. And the nice part about this is that if you decided to turn this into an Express application where you wanted to show your users, you simply have to create an Express app and use this DB object to get the data that you want. And then instead of actually having hard-coded data in your application, you could end up getting data from a database by using SQLite.